A new piece out of the Daily Poster takes a hard look at the way government has cut audits of people making more than $1 million a year. The report also reveals how the IRS and local officials are hiring an army of for-profit debt collection companies to target millions of low-income people who can't pay their court fees.
Let's take a look at the numbers. The investigation found that Americans now have $27 billion of outstanding debt from court fees, and government agencies are hiring private debt collectors who can tack on 25% surcharges to boost their own profits. One debt collection firm now has $500 million of revenue. Journalist and founder of the Daily Poster, David Sirota, joins us to discuss. Great to see you, David.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
So tell us more about this story. What do the people need to know about this practice?
Well, there's $27 billion of outstanding court fees, and that's a conservative estimate. Those are from the states that we know about court fees. So that is to say that people in America, millions of people, owe a collective amount of $27 billion in outstanding court fees. These are fees from everything from appearing in court on felony or misdemeanor charges to traffic tickets to other municipal violations. And state and local governments are hiring for-profit debt collectors to try to collect that debt. Now, part of the problem with that is that when for-profit debt collectors are hired by governments, as opposed to by other private companies, they are effectively exempted from debtor protection laws, which allows them to be more aggressive in trying to collect these debts from people who can't pay them than they might be if they were hired by a private bank or the like. Congress, by the way, is now debating a piece of legislation to apply existing debtor protection laws to these debt collection companies. But here's the other point that you alluded to, which is that the private for-profit debt collectors, in many cases, are allowed to tack on additional fees to the fees that they are collecting in order to boost their own profits. Anywhere from 25% up to 40% they can tack on to the fees that they are trying to collect from debtors.
And David, is that how it normally works? I mean, you mentioned debt collector protection laws or debtor laws that protect essentially the consumers when these debt collection companies are trying to collect these debts. Don't they normally have to collect a portion of the original fee amount instead of tacking additional on? Because it seems a little bit obviously predatory to tack amounts on to people who are having a hard time paying the debt anyway.
Well, here's what often happens is that a company that has outstanding debts will hire a debt collector, and the debt collector will essentially say, we're going to pay back only a portion of the debt that you are owed. That the company will essentially take some form of a loss to recoup some of its money, and the debt collector essentially makes profit off of the difference between what they collect and what they have said that they're going to collect to their client. In this situation, you have a situation where the debt collector can actually tack on more than the client, than the debtor themselves owes, in order to pad their profits. One of the main debt collectors has been hired across the country, private debt collectors, has reported the estimate is that they make between $200 and $500 million of revenue every year.
David, you took to Twitter to break down the downside of being an independent media outlet, saying that it often leads to dismissal from the mainstream media just because of a lack of notoriety and elite branding, clearing the path for outlets like the New York Times to win a Pulitzer despite mediocre reporting. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. I mean, what I was alluding to is the fact that there are stories like this that are huge stories happening to millions of people all across the country. And we have a kind of Washington-centric, Acela corridor-centric media, elite media, that focuses on perhaps the palace drama of Washington, but doesn't necessarily focus on stories like this. I mean, this is a story, as in one example, the debt collection industry and what it does to people. This is a story that really does affect millions and millions of people, but because it's not a sort of a story in Washington, it's not a story in elite media, it often gets ignored. And so one of the challenges for independent media is to try to get stories like this attention so that state and local officials that don't like what's going on know to take action about it. But look, the game is rigged against independent media. And I think but I will say this, I think people are losing faith in elite corporate media, and that's why you've seen an upsurge in more interest in independent media, which I actually think ultimately is a very good thing.
Look, here at The Hill and at Rising, we couldn't agree more. We often attack the legacy media for not covering the kinds of things that we try to cover here. So we're on the same page with that. I have an interesting question about that, David. Fundamentally, advertising that supports a lot of potentially independent outlets for media, it's difficult for them to get any of these revenues to expand or to even stay alive in some cases because it's so tightly dominated by Google and or Facebook. And there are some antitrust lawsuits that are coming out that would potentially break those up. Do you think that would be helpful to independent media outlets like yourself?
Oh, certainly. Absolutely. I mean, I think anything that breaks up the oligopoly of corporate elite legacy media to create a system where there are more media outlets, more mid-sized and small media outlets, rather than just a few huge behemoths. I think that's a good thing. And I should add, look, that's the history of America. I mean, we're all used to living in an era where there are just a handful of huge corporate conglomerates that effectively dominate the media ecosystem. But, 80, 100 years ago, there were many, many smaller outlets that had sustainable business models. So I think we can go back to that era, but I do think, as you allude to, there need to be some legal changes to essentially break up some of that oligopoly.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot on this show. I'm a little more skeptical. I think it might actually benefit the New York Times if Facebook was broken up into a bunch of other companies. Facebook can occasionally actually be an engine for independent and contrarian and alternative content. But what going back to this story and the reporting you've done, and thank you for that. What should lawmakers do? What is the policy change you'd like to see to prevent this practice going forward?
Well, I think there's plenty of things that lawmakers can do. I mean, they can essentially not use, if they're in a position to make those decisions, they can just simply not use private debt collectors. State lawmakers can say to local communities, you can't use private debt collectors. They can also, as I mentioned earlier, Congress or even states can say that if a municipality uses a private debt collector, that those private debt collectors have to be constrained by the same laws that private debt collectors are constrained by when they are collecting debts for a bank or for another kind of creditor. So there are plenty of things that these lawmakers can do. And again, it's a $27 billion problem right now across the country. And that is, think about people who are struggling to pay their bills, healthcare, for a potential eviction crisis. And now they're dealing with a court debt that governments, by the way, don't have to incur. I mean, that's the other thing. Moving forward, these fees that are tacked on to the legal system when people are dealing with the legal system, states and localities can simply not have those fees. Yeah,
I was going to say that too. Don't we need, it's one thing to tackle the existing debt problem. We don't need to make it worse and add to it by we can stop over-criminalizing everything. We can stop fining people for everything. We can make the legal system, work for people and not over-police them, and not even try to collect that money in the first place, and then you wouldn't have this problem, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a huge point. I kind of buried the lead, which is correct. Moving forward, when somebody is in front of the legal system, which is an unpleasant process unto itself and an expensive process to defend yourself and all the other things that it incurs, to then additionally add on court fees, it's adding insult to injury. Now, the state and local governments would say we need a way to pay for our courts, but essentially making it a user fee. Right? That's essentially what this is doing, making it essentially a user fee on people who are already in a struggle, in a situation, in a conflict with the system. Again, just makes the problem worse.
Yeah, it really does. And a lot of times these fees, are punitive in nature anyway. And so that's a portion of it. The interesting kind of construct here is that on one hand, the people with salaries over $1 million a year are not being audited nearly as much, and on the other hand, private debt collectors are chasing down people who are in the worst economic positions in this country. It's great reporting, a wonderful story. David, it is always a pleasure for you to join us. Thank you for everything you do and for your independent journalism, sir.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
We'll be right back with more Rising right after this.